Centuries ago, stories were like Cinderella stories. The saintly main character went through horrible things, triumphed in the end, and everything turned out okay. The moral of the story was, virtue is rewarded, evil is punished. The intention of the super clean stories was to promote virtues and morality, avoid corruption and temptation, and encourage the ideal society. The problem with that was that people knew that real life and real people were more complex than the stories showed. That people couldn't measure up to the saintly standards of the main character, who never had a vengeful thought, never spoke amiss, and never did anything immoral. Like that's even possible. So, understandably, people wanted realism, stories that reflected true life. Their solution? To create gritty, complex characters and stories that portray the hard realities of life. The tone was darker, harsher, and definitely more true to real-life experience. That's how we got characters like Frodo, whose quest to save Middle-earth ends up costing him more than he ever imagined. He realizes that the success of his quest gave others a future at the expense of his own. Eugenides finds himself in situations where the choices aren't between a good choice and a bad choice, but between two bad choices. Although he does his best to do right by his people and those he loves, he's in over his head. Theo ends up in the middle of a war that tears everything he loves away from him. But far worse is the reality that the enemy that must be overcome does not wear the uniform of the Regions, but lives inside his own heart. Theo's adventure indicates a shift in the traditional view of villains and heroes. In the Cinderella story days, the villain and the hero were strikingly different. What about today, since the revolution of realism? What makes a villain different than a hero? Well, in today's literature, a villain lies, cheats, steals, womanizes, and kills. A hero lies, cheats, steals, womanizes, and kills. So what is the difference between the villain and the hero? There's a problem here. I can't tell who is who unless the story makes it clear who I should be rooting for. But why should I root for either? Good intentions don't mean anything without follow-through. In other words, we are what we do. And unfortunately, what heroes in modern literature do is essentially the same as what villains do. For example, heroes have no problem going to bed with others for whom they may or may not have fine feelings, but often to whom they have not committed, in scenes replete with verbal pornography, which add nothing to the story save random sexual titillation. In addition, the worldly wisdom of the hard-boiled main character is somehow not apparent enough by his character alone, and must be reinforced with expletives that the writer would never allow his own children to utter. Finally, the hero whom audiences are expected to root for indulges in violence of a level that, were the bad guys to commit it, would be considered horrific and appalling. I believe we were made for more, and therefore, our stories should offer more. We were made to bring courage to the suffering. We were made to bring hope to the hopeless. We were made for an eternal destiny and purpose. Our lives mean something. The solution to heroes who are the same as villains? Create heroes who aim for honor and stories that resonate with our inner hunger for purpose. Just so we're clear, realism doesn't have to detract from the imaginative elements that we all love in science fiction and fantasy. Focusing on realism doesn't have to mean that the story is unimaginative, nor does it have to mean that the story is hopeless, boring, crude and profane, or immoral, or predictable. Instead, focusing on realism should mean that the story and characters are believable, that the story is able to speak to universal experience, and that the story is true to the flavor of actual life. There's a lot of room for fantastical and supernatural elements to act within the framework of this definition of realism. And what about honor? Is the quest for honor going to squeeze the life out of what could have been a great story? I don't think it has to. Focusing on honor doesn't have to mean that the characters are passive, or that the story is trite, or shallow, or boring, or preachy and moralistic. True honor is not wimpy or shallow. Focusing on honor should mean that the hero's attitude encourages integrity, that the story is clear on the difference between the good guys and the bad guys, even when the heroes have realistic faults and failures in judgment, and even when the villain has some relatable or likable elements to his character. And that the story drives toward purpose and meaning, acknowledging that life, and what we do in it, means something. Realism. Honor. Imagination. Don't settle for less.